Okay, hi everyone. I'm so excited that so many of you were able to join today. So this is a webinar on the new version of the Human Rights in the U.S. Handbook for public interest attorneys. I'm Professor Lauren Bartlett. I am at St. Louis University School of Law, where I direct a human rights at home litigation clinic. I also was the big major editor of this last version of the handbook released in January. I also was an author and editor of previous versions of the handbook, and I had lots of help. It's not just me at all. So I'm going to go through that, save that. And some of you who are on this webinar today had big hand in getting this done, this new version done, also the previous version. I am very excited about this new handbook. We spent years, started the new version, started the research and everything in 2019. So it took a while to get this done. So very excited to have it released. I am also going to be publishing a law review article arguing why this is relevant today and talking about the history of the handbook. Once I get that locked down, I will let you all know where to look for it and be sure to share it as well. And so there's a question in the chat, and I love questions, so please don't hesitate to interrupt. I'll also pause every 10 or 15 minutes or so, and if you want to speak, just put your hand up and I can let you speak. Because of the number of folks who RSVP'd, I put this into webinar version because my personal Zoom doesn't allow for that many folks on a meeting. So question in the chat is, would it be possible to purchase a hardbound copy? So I don't have, I'm not planning to publish this at all in hard on paper. And one big reason for that is we're planning to do lots of updates. I'm going to talk about that. But actually, even since I released it in January, there are new versions up in the Google Drive. And those new, so I would, I know some people love paper, but I would really encourage you to look at this online, and not even to download it to your desktop, but to just view it in the Google Drive. And if you do happen to download it, go ahead and delete it and go back into the Google Drive next time you need to use it. So again, please feel free to interrupt me with questions. I'm also recording today. There's lots of folks who weren't able to join us at this time and are interested in viewing the webinar. I'm also planning other webinars, so this isn't the only one. Most likely in the future, these will be more issue area focused, and it won't just be me talking. I'll be sure to invite some other attorneys who've used human rights in state and federal court to join us, and before policymakers, of course. So let's get started. One thing I would love for you all to do right away is to open a copy of the new version of the handbook so that you can toggle back and forth between this presentation and the handbook. I put the link into the slide, but also I'll drop it into the chat so you can get the link. And again, there were new versions uploaded in January. There's new versions uploaded today, fixing some typos and some spacing issues. We plan to add new things to this as we go along. So please, again, consider just taking a look at the Google Drive whenever you're ready to use it. So what are we going to do today? So today I'm going to really focus on familiarizing you with the 2026 version of the handbook. So in terms of who's on this webinar, we have some law students, we have some public interest attorneys who have been working in this field and using human rights quite a bit. And then we have folks who are really new to human rights. And so I'm going to go everyone is welcome. Everyone will not, I promise you, you can ask questions, but I hope that you won't get lost. You can have no human rights background at all and still, use this handbook and still get a lot out of this presentation today, I hope. Okay, so an overview of how to use the handbook, right? And some examples of some really great examples of attorneys who've used the handbook in their litigation and policy making, the old version, right? And then I'm not going to cover all the sections. That's just because of time. And again, planning to have more webinars in the future. So this will be an overview and more to come. Be patient. Okay, so again, if you have questions, put them in the chat or you can raise your hand and I will try to get to those as I go along. So I want to tell you about how this handbook came to be and tell you about the specific updates that were made to the handbook that was released in January. But first, I wanted to share with you my briefest argument as to why this handbook and why human rights are relevant to us today. And I think that human rights have never been more important today in the United States at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level than today. So I'm going to just read you, this is actually a paragraph from the Law Review article that I'm going to be publishing. I'm paraphrasing, but and at a time when it is hard to see a way forward past reacting to the immediate terrible events of today, human rights offer a long-term vision of a future world, a world in which we want to live and we want to work. Human rights are not only laws, human rights are tools helping to build movements across the world. Human rights can also empower individuals and communities to forge a better tomorrow, and they provide pathways to a more just, equitable society where everyone, even the most marginalized persons, can live in dignity and peace. So again, more to come, but I really do believe that this is so very important. And so glad that I was able to I'm actually on sabbatical this semester, and so glad I was able to have this sabbatical so I could finally get this pushed out. Because it's really hard to practice and teach and do all this, the rest of this. So the handbook. And I know there are some of you on this that could tell this story better than me, but it all started back in 2011 with the local human rights lawyering project, which was based at the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at American University, Washington College of Law. So I was wonderfully hired by the center to help train and provide technical assistance to legal aid attorneys to integrate human rights into their everyday work, into litigation, into office systems, into attorney-client relationships, policymaking. We only at that time were focused on legal aid attorneys, but it quickly blossomed, grew from there to include public defenders, other public interest attorneys. But the original handbook that was released in 2013 was titled Human Rights in the U.S., a Handbook for Legal Aid Attorneys. I've changed the name in this new version to reflect, which was pretty much the case from the beginning, that this was a handbook meant for more than just legal aid attorneys. But the project where this handbook originated started out focusing on legal aid attorneys. In fact, we provided funding for human rights coordinators, attorneys that were working for Maryland Legal Aid and Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. This was for a set period of time. They were the human rights coordinators, Rena Shaw at Maryland Legal Aid, Nelson Mock at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, who spent full time working to integrate human rights into litigation and policy work. And the idea of the handbook came from these legal aid partners who said, we need written materials. If we're trying to integrate human rights into everyday work of every single legal aid attorney, we're going to need the how-to. We're going to need easily accessible, practical information that can be on the desk, on the desktop of every single attorney. And so that's where the handbook came from. And quickly, they were also the ones who said, look, this is a great tool. We want to share this across the country, not just in our offices, but with legal aid offices in every state, right, in every county. And that's just what we did. I spent quite a bit of time in 2013 to 15 traveling around, giving trainings, lots of trainings. In the end, we trained over 1,500 legal aid attorneys, I think, if you count all the different trainings that we did. So lots of trainings, but also lots of amazing stories that have come out of the handbook and that work. And a lot of that is in the updated version of the handbook, which is really exciting. So overarching goals of the handbook, right? To integrate human rights into the everyday work of public interest attorneys here in the US, into legal arguments. And I'm going to be going through an overview, giving you some examples today as quickly as I can. And then also client-staff relationships and office systems. There is a chapter on that, or a section on that in the handbook. I'm not going to talk about that today, but happy to talk with you or do a training on that if you're interested. I've written a law review article on that specific issue. And then to help human rights attorneys use additional advocacy tools, right? So not just litigation in state and federal court, but think about filing a petition with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Think about, writing a complaint to a UN Special Rapporteur, right? All of that how-to is here in that handbook, and which is really exciting. And again, there's no way we can talk about all of this today, but I'm going to give you a sort of overview of the handbook. And last but not least, we updated this thing, and it's still those goals all apply. But thank you to the dozens of experts, law faculty, law students who helped with these updates. I'm going to go through what we updated specifically, but this was a effort that took many people. And I thank them from the bottom of my heart, every single one of you. So American University, Washington College of Law, Northeastern University School of Law, Santa Clara, University of Illinois, UMass, and St. Louis, all of us worked on this updated version of the handbook. So we added 4 new substantive sections: water and sanitation rights, right to privacy, rights of Indigenous persons, and human rights defenders, all really important issues. We would love to add more substantive sections. I've already had since January requests for more sections. I am open to working with folks who are interested in adding sections. I think there's so much more that we should be doing and could be doing. And I have plans for a few more, just need more time to do that. So if you're interested, send me an email. We can talk about what that looks like. If there's anything I can help you out with to get that done. So there are new definitions of the human rights. Some areas of human rights have just gone bonkers, expanded significantly since 2014. For example, environmental human rights really has gone, just really flourished. and some other example, rights to public assistance also internationally has really grown and developed. So data, case law, case studies, all of that we updated in the various sections of the handbook. We also did our best to add as many sample briefs, complaints, shadow reports. We know that those examples are so important if you really want this to be usable and practical. So try to add as much as that as we could find. There's a lot more out there. I know some of you on this call have examples. Please send those to me. I will add them in as if you would like to share. So please, this is a group effort, obviously. Okay. It is also, the handbook is now available section by section online. We had originally just released the handbook in this PDF. It was a 200 plus page PDF. It is now 400 pages. So broke it up into sections, did our best to make it a little bit more digestible. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of repetitiveness in the handbook, especially in the issue area sections, and that's okay. From the beginning, we said we wanted each issue section to sort of stand alone, and that would require there to be some, repetitiveness, as there are. Human rights are intersectional, right, and interconnected, and so there's always going to be overlap when we're talking about human rights. But even just in terms of citing to cases, you might see the same case in multiple sections because there were multiple rights at issue, right? And that's okay. But just warning you, that's part of why this is such a giant, long handbook. And again, why it took us so long to update it. So on that point, we have a plan now to continuously update the handbook so that it's not going to get quickly out of date, right? So my clinic students are going to take on the important task of updating the handbook. So please send additional briefs, petitions, case studies, right? You can also, there's a QR code here. It's at the end of every chapter of the handbook as well. You can send edits, additions, right? Ideas. If you find a typo, even whatever you want to send, please send it over. You can also email if you don't like the form that we have online. Really open and hoping that this is a work in progress forever. So excited to see where this goes, excited to see all of the wonderful materials that you're willing to share that we can add to this handbook. Okay, I'll pause there for a moment. Oh, great. Okay, I will add into the chat. I see the QR code is not working. I will add into the chat in a moment the Google, the link to make edits. But I want to pause and see if there's any, while I'm doing that, you can, hold on. While I'm doing that, you can let me know if you have any questions. If you raise your hand, I'm happy to unmute you and you can ask a question if you don't want to put it into the chat. But what I'm doing now is just putting into the chat the link instead of the QR code for making suggested edits. There you go. That link should work. Let me know if it doesn't. I'm not seeing any raised hands, any other questions, but feel free to interrupt as I go. Happy to try and answer questions as I go. Okay, so let me set this back up again for you. I'm a little rusty at doing online teaching and online webinars. There was a time when I was like doing it so often I was like a pro, and it's been a while. So please bear with me for a moment while I get this back set up. Okay. Okay. So thanks again for bearing with me. Okay, so finally we're going to get to the going through the handbook itself. So wanted to talk about the acknowledgement section really quick, which is in this new version, we did not include individual names of authors or editors or any of the individuals who worked on the original version of Handbook or this updated version due to the current political climate. So we had many dozens of law students who worked on this new version, and some were uncomfortable including their names. And so we decided to just include institutional names going forward. But please note, there are many experts, not just students, whose time and energy went into this handbook over the last decade. Really appreciative of all of you. Some of you are on this webinar. So in terms of an overview, Chapter 2 and 3 of the handbook are designed to introduce public interest attorneys to the human rights framework and to provide the background necessary to begin strategically integrating human rights into your advocacy and policy work, right? Chapter 3 specifically focuses on those additional human rights tools, right? How do you advocate before the United Nations, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, right? And then Chapter 4 focuses specifically on litigation, right? Providing specific information for making human rights in state and federal court, what to do, what not to do. And then we get to Chapter 5, which is the specific legal issue areas. And we're not going to have time to go through all of that today, all of those legal issues, but I will give you a few examples. Hopefully we'll have time for that. So going back to Chapter 2, Human Rights are 101, right? So what are human rights? What is human rights law? What sources of human rights law are relevant to U.S. courts, right? That's the basics of Chapter 2. And sort of to give you an overview, right, we are looking at treaties, which are essentially like a contract between governments. There's not always the name treaty in the instrument, right? Sometimes it's called a convention, a covenant, international agreement, right? So that's one source of human rights law that you're going to see in the handbook are treaties. Customary international norms. This is a really important part of international law. Those of you who took a course in international law in law school, probably spent weeks on customary international norms, right? It's evidence of a general practice accepted by law, right? And the general practice of what the states have accepted as law. There's not a specific section by section here on customary international norms for a variety of different reasons, but it does show up in a few places in the handbook, and wanted to mention that. We also have declarations and resolutions, right? These are issued by international bodies such as the United Nations. They're not treaties, right? They're not signed and ratified by member nations and member states across the world, right? They're not binding, but they can provide evidence of agreement by the international community. And examples are Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? American Declaration of Human Rights, resolutions by the UN, Human Rights Council, etc. Right? Again, not binding law, but can provide evidence of the definition of a human right, or provide evidence of growing agreement that could turn into customary international norms, right? Really important. Then we have case law, right? Before international courts, sub-regional courts, right? Like the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, or even foreign courts, like the Constitutional Court of South Africa, Supreme Court of India, really important. We also would look at the European Court of Human Rights, right? Lots of important courts looking at human rights law, defining human rights law in their jurisdiction. We can look to those sister jurisdictions and look to see what they're doing, right? And then, of course, U.S. law. There's U.S. case law. There's that is looking at human rights law, right? And really making decisions based in human rights. We also have statutes. We have ordinances and local county code, right? That has adopted human rights language, has adopted provisions from international human rights treaties. Lots of important U.S. law. So Chapter 2 introduces you to all of these sources and provides you with some examples. So this is one of the pages in Chapter 2, looking at a sampling of universal human rights instruments. We see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We also see the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So you'll see this sort of table, the same looking table throughout the handbook. We're trying to give you examples of treaties, declarations that might be useful in your work. So you'll see there's a flag underneath the ICCPR. That means the U.S. has signed and ratified that international instrument, right? The U.S. has only signed and ratified 3 human rights treaties, universal United Nations human rights treaties. I've given you one here. You can guess what the other 2 are if you have any guesses. And so each of these tables will show you the name, the treaty or declaration name, the description. It gives you the citation, the date it was either open for signature, the date it entered into force, and then the U.S. action. So has the U.S. ratified or signed this convention? You can see that we ratified the ICCPR on September 8th, 1992, the last human rights treaty that the U.S. has ratified. Lovely. More than 30 years ago. There was one that we came really close to ratifying in 2012. Anybody know what that one was? Ooh, no cigar. Okay, so you'll see this again, this sort of chart. There's pages and pages of charts for various specific legal issue areas and otherwise giving you information about what's relevant. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about relevancy of human rights law and what you should and should not do, what you can and cannot do in terms of citing to international human rights treaties. So this is part of Chapter 2, goes into Chapter 3 of the handbook. But so we have this great thing, the U.S. Constitution, the Supremacy Clause, Article 4, Clause 2, states that treaties shall be the supreme law of the land, up there with this Constitution and the federal laws, right? So why are we not paying more attention to human rights treaties if they are the supreme law of the land, right? This is a place we need to start as attorneys looking at using human rights law in U.S. courts. So we've got the Supremacy Clause, great. The problem is that when the U.S. signs and ratifies a treaty, right? So president signs, and then underneath, attached to the signature, are something called reservations, understandings, and declarations, RUDs, right? I always think of the RUSs from The Princess Bride, right? Like the rodents of an unusual size, because it is just like this thing that pops up and is a problematic whenever I talk or teach about this. But so whenever we sign a human rights treaty, but most treaties, we enter reservations, understandings, and declarations. And for all of the three human rights treaties that we have signed and ratified, we put these same things in there. The first thing says that this treaty is non-self-executing. Congress must enact implementing legislation separately. So great, except for Congress has never enacted implementing legislation for the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination or for the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the implementing legislation for the Convention Against Torture, the TVPA, Torture Victims Protection Act, right, is also limited. And so great. Ooh, thanks, President. Thanks, Senate, right? The next thing we always put in reservations, understandings, and declarations, right? No private right of action. Individuals cannot sue for violation of rights recognized under the treaties. This is an important one. This is what bars us from, claim 1, Article 1 of the ICCPR, right? We can't make a claim directly under the human rights treaty on behalf of an individual against a government. And then the third important one is that treaty protections go no further than corresponding protections in domestic law. So when the U.S. signed the Convention Against Torture, we said that the definition of torture is equivalent to our Eighth Amendment jurisprudence, essentially, right? So that the definition of torture goes, and our understanding of the definition of torture in this treaty goes no further than our Eighth Amendment jurisprudence, which causes lots of problems, right? Because what is even the good of that if we're just saying that our law is the best law or our law is the definition, right? So problems, but that's not the end of the story, right? There's lots of ways that human rights law can be used in state and federal court. But it's not as simple as citing to the treaty and making a claim under the treaty, right? And so that's what makes this complicated. That's why we have a handbook. That's why we have all of these examples and all of this information for you. So talked about something a little bit more happy, a little bit more fun. Chapter 3 goes into strategies for using international human rights in everyday work. Really practical information about filing complaints with UN Special Rapporteurs, lots of examples, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, a great chapter that was updated recently, providing lots of great samples on using commission for thematic hearings, for individual petitions. And I think we'll have there's been lots of trainings, I know, for attorneys in the US from the Bringing Human Rights Home Network, way back with the US Human Rights Network, right? And there will be more to come, but happy to chat with folks who are interested in getting involved. There is an upcoming deadline for the Universal Periodic Review of the US by the UN Human Rights Council in April. If anybody's interested in submitting information, we have about 6 weeks to do that. And there's some good examples in that chapter of information submitted by civil society to the Human Rights Council last year, et cetera. And again, lots of questions I'm sure that you have about what it means that the U.S. withdrew from the Human Rights Council, that the U.S. refused to participate last year in the Universal Periodic Review, what that means going forward. I have lots of questions too, but that doesn't mean we stop advocating and stop as civil society members and as attorneys for civil society members, right? Doing what we are allowed to do, what we're supposed to do, and continuing that good advocacy work. Okay, so then we have chapter 4. I'm moving forward through this so that we can hopefully get to some good examples, specific examples for you all. So human rights litigation in U.S. courts. I know a lot of you are most interested in that. And so this is the section that goes through what to do, right? And gives you sample arguments, cut and pastable. So that's the whole thing with this handbook is please plagiarize, use this handbook, cut and paste into your briefs, right? Print out the talking points in the issue areas sections in chapter 5, right? Take those to court with you, right? We're not asking you to start from scratch. We've got great examples throughout this handbook. So here we have these sample arguments. We also have some really good arguments as to why human rights law is relevant, right? So I just went through some bad news about human rights law, what not to do, right? But here we're going to talk a little bit about arguments you can make as to why human rights is relevant. And then in chapter 4.4, we get into the human rights case law in specific states. And you might say, well, why did you choose these 5 states? This was a matter of when we were working with the legal aid attorneys, we focused on these 5 states. We put in these 5 states and did a lot of work on the case law then. I tried to get some other states updated and added, and it just didn't happen this time around, but really interested in adding more states. There's also a document, another handbook essentially called Human Rights in State Courts that was released last by the Opportunity Agenda in 2017. It's linked to in that chapter. I know it's now several years out of date, but that has every single state and case law from those states, and eventually hope to, again, add more states in here. Okay, so here are some great arguments as to how human rights is relevant to U.S. courts and policymakers. I'm going to go through these 5 arguments. These are not the only arguments, right? And then I'm going to show you a couple of example arguments based on these statements. These 5 specific relevancy arguments came from Professor Martha Davis at Northeastern, who is wonderful, my guru. I love her. And this is from an article that she wrote 20 years ago now, but still relevant today. And I use these as sort of a baseline, right? So some state constitutions may support, if not compel, looking to international law for legal interpretation of domestic law, right? West Virginia and Maryland both, right, have their own supremacy clause essentially in the state constitution. We could think about in other states, right, constitutional amendments to do the same, right? So really exciting if you're in Maryland or West Virginia, and really exciting potential for amendments going forward. And we know constitutional amendments, here in Missouri, we love to amend the Constitution. Happens all the time, for good and for not good. And lots of states have amended constitutions recently to add rights to healthy environment, rights to water, lots of exciting human rights amendments. So something to think about. And then second argument, human rights jurisprudence may offer precedent and models more on point for the case than anything in the federal system or in your sister states. I'm going to show you a great example of this in just a moment. But right, that's going to be true when we're looking at housing law, environment, right? So many places where the case law statutes from other parts of the world is so ahead of the United States. Something we can look to when there's just nothing here in our system, our domestic system. And then state courts should interpret U.S. law as consistent with the international law whenever possible, right? This is from if you took international law, hopefully you covered this case, still good law from the U.S. Supreme Court, right? And here's another one, if you need the Supreme Court citation, right? But when there's no controlling U.S. law, state courts should look to customary international norms for guidance for its decision. From the wonderful seminal case Roper v. Simmons, right, which banned the juvenile death penalty. So another Supreme Court argument, right, again valid, where there's no controlling U.S. law, state courts should look to customary international norms for guidance in its decision. And then the last one, this is sort of the catch-all relevancy article, but state courts should be part of the transnational dialogue on human rights simply because it's a vital conversation that promotes universal values. So I always think back when I see this one to, we were doing a training in Maryland when I was directing the local human rights lawyering project, and we had a judge on one of our panels, and she said, at that point, she said, I've been sitting here waiting. I've been on the bench for more than 10 years, and I've been sitting here waiting for someone to come into my courtroom and make a human rights argument, and no one has. And she's like, I just think it's so important and such a vital conversation. I've been waiting. So I mean, you just never know. And really exciting, but sort of, something to hang, giving the judge something to hang their hat on, right? If they really want to make a decision for your client. So example of that first argument, that first relevancy argument, right, is in chapter 4. So this is a sample argument. Again, this is meant to be something you could cut and paste into a brief, right? Something that you could, you can take part of it, you could alter it however you want, but to give you an idea of what you could be arguing in a brief that would support this first relevancy argument, right? And every one of the 5 relevancy arguments has a sample argument, cut and pasteable argument that you could add to a brief. I want to give you another example. This one probably fits best under category 2, but maybe relevancy argument 2, maybe even relevancy argument 5. But this is a great example from a case out of Maryland, again. This is Rivera versus Montgomery County, Maryland. This was brought in 2016. It's in the handbook. This complaint and the opinion, the judge's opinion, are in the handbook in section 5.13.7, 5.13.7. And so the essential facts of the case were an attorney from Maryland Legal Aid and a law student were trying to visit their client who lived and worked on a farm in Montgomery County. And when they got to the gate of the farm, the farmer was there and did not allow them entrance to see their client. In fact, the farmer called the police, and the police showed up and issued a trespassing ticket to both the attorney and to the law student. The attorney and the law student filed this complaint against the Montgomery County. And Montgomery County argued in a motion to dismiss that the trespassing charges had been dropped against the attorney and the law student. And so the case was moot. And so in their response to the motion to dismiss, Maryland Legal Aid, who was represented by ACLU of Maryland, argued that the abuses such as these trespassing charges brought against attorneys trying to visit clients on farms and ranches, right, are so common that there's coalitions of legal aid groups, advocacy groups, healthcare organizations, legal clinics, right? They've been petitioning United Nations human rights officials and officials at the Organization of American States on this exact issue for years, right? About denial of access for outreach workers to migrant worker camps in the United States. And they cited to the a report to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights that Maryland Legal Aid Bureau and a coalition of 14 other groups had submitted to the UN Special Rapporteur in 2013. And wonderfully, in the Rivero case, the judge sided with Maryland Legal Aid and did not dismiss the case, right? Even though the trespassing charges have been dropped. This is something that kept happening, was happening with this farm, with other farms in Maryland. So, right, a really great example. Use human rights reports as evidence of abuse or patterns of abuse to help your case, right? Standing. This is a standing issue example from the Rivero case. And then when facts, this is another idea. When facts of the case are so shocking and outside of the norm, use human rights language to get a judge's attention, right? Instead of listing all the various things that are wrong, on behalf of a prisoner in jail, right? Use the word torture, right? Consider also citing to human rights reports, right? So some cautions here, right? Initially use human rights only to bolster strong local, state, and national law arguments, right? Because you need to know your judge, you need to know the court, right? You don't want this to be seen as Hail Mary argument, something like that, right? So know the judge, educate the judge, especially when you are not familiar with how they're going to react to these sorts of arguments. And then, if you're going to use human rights in appellate work, you must preserve it at the trial level. So consider adding a line in your complaint, making other, in your response to a motion to dismiss, whatever you're going to do, right? But think about it at the beginning of the case as well. So glad that we got to all that. The last part is chapter 5, which is the specific legal issue areas chapter. We now have 17 sections. This is the bulk of the handbook at this point, right? Really exciting that we were able to add 4 new issue area sections at the very end, and lots of really great information to the rest of the sections, lots of samples, etc. So I'll just go really quickly through what these sections look like, right? Each of them gives you an introduction to the right, whatever rights we're talking about. And then we give you specific quick statistics, also places you can go for data. We're trying to give you statistics, U.S. statistics on the right, but also international, right? If you are going to be arguing something about international human rights law or something that's happening around the world, not just here, make sure you have that data. And then relevant human rights law. So we go through ratified human rights instruments like the ICCPR, right? And then other non-ratified instruments. We give you cases in the U.S. courts, right? U.S. law statutes, if there is any that are relevant, international statutes, foreign statutes, cases before international bodies like the International Court of Justice, and the European Court of Human Rights. Then we give you some from sister jurisdictions, Canada, the UK, right? Other places. And then we've got some treaty body, charter-based body, special procedures, commentary, and recommendations, which really can be on point, give you really good models, really good language that you could use in your briefs, even if you're not citing to them. Then sample arguments, talking points you could print out and take with you to court, again, sample arguments that you're going to cut and paste, or maybe you change the facts or you change the argument, you take part of it. Maybe it's just a framework you're going to use, right? Case studies of public interest attorneys who have done this, right? Have made some sort of argument before a policymaker or before a court. Sample briefs and petitions, and other resources that we think you might be interested in. So we tried in this new version of the handbook, this is just an example, chapter 5.12, to give you, if there's another chapter or two that are relevant or most relevant or have a lot of overlap, we put that right under the title chapter. That's something new. Big introduction to the right, quick statistics, the instruments, as I explained, right? State and federal court, U.S. law, U.S. case law, and then statutes in the U.S., right? This is environmental human rights, so lots of constitutional amendments, as I mentioned earlier, recently on right to healthy environment, right to water, recently, case law, and then we get to sample arguments, right? Again, a warning, these arguments should be used to supplement your state and federal law-based claims and defenses. Don't rely on these arguments alone. Most of this sections, issue area sections, have several arguments. Some are missing arguments still. I think actually just one chapter. I'm working on those. And then these talking points correspond to the written arguments. So the idea is that you would use the sample argument in a brief. The talking points you could print and take with you for oral arguments, but they correspond to the written arguments. And then case studies, if they're available, right? If not, we're working on that. Please send in your examples. Sample briefs and petitions and other resources. So that's all. I'm going to stop here and make sure there's plenty of time for questions. Thank you all so much for attending. Again, I did record this and we'll be putting the recording up on YouTube and hoping to host a few more webinars in the months to come. If you have specific ideas or specific requests, you can email me. Would love to hear from you. But if you have any questions, please, I'll stop sharing my screen. Please put them in the chat, or if you raise your hand, I'm happy to let you speak. And again, sorry we had to do it in this webinar format. It was just lots of folks who RSVP'd. I was worried there wouldn't be enough space otherwise. Questions? Thank you all so much for attending. I really appreciate it, and for your interest. I will share once this law review article gets published. This sort of gives more of the background, more details on edits. Anybody who's a law professor, some ideas for teaching using the handbook as well. Thank you.